couple of days ago, I made this video reacting to the Hell Is Us PC system requirements where I said, wow, those ultra settings look pretty demanding considering the fact that it says upscaling is enabled. However, I then pinned a comment after the developers clarified that the upscaling involved was probably not as aggressive as people may have thought. Again, these were the system requirements charts. I already did a system requirements video. However, now we have the actual game demo out there, which while it's not the full game, it gives us a chance to investigate performance, which is what we're doing right now. Now, if we go ahead and check out the video settings, I've set this to 4K Ultra preset. Notice that the Ultra preset does not engage DLSS, although it does use upscaling. It's using TSR, so Unreal Engine 5's temporal super resolution technology, but the Ultra preset defaults to 90% of resolution. Now, that's usually per axis. Now, something like DLSS quality would generally be all the way down at 67% per axis. So this is not a very aggressive upscale. It's very close to the native rendering resolution. Scrolling down through the rest of the stuff here, and of course, I will try out DLSS while we're at this. But let's go ahead and play the game. So, now I have tried this out ahead of time, but it was on an RTX 4060 mobile on my lunch break. So this is actually the first time I am having the 4090 system run this game. Now, if this runs well, I think we can also test out lower end hardware and see how it goes. Again, I actually have taken a look at how this ran on an RTX 4060. Now, one thing I want to show you here is that the cutscenes seem to be locked to 30 frames per second. And I will say that, again, playing this on my lunch break a little bit already, I really like the intro cutscene to the game. It kind of grabs my attention. I want to know what's going on. Who is this guy? You know, what is this setting? There's a lot of questions raised by the intro. I'm a sucker for this kind of setup, so I did like that quite a bit. Now, as we load in here, I'll say graphically, you know, it doesn't, I'm not sure they're using like nanite geometry and things like that, even though this is Unreal Engine 5, because I do see some things pop in as they load. You can see some stutters and blips in the frame time graph as it's trying to cap to 30 frames per second. Let's go ahead and skip that. And here we go with the first actual little bit of gameplay, and oh man, they suggest playing on a controller. Well, I'm gonna have to invert my invert my camera settings because I'm just that kind of a person. There we go. Anyway, so RTX 4090 Ultra preset. So this is lining up to what the developers suggested, which is when they said 30 FPS, they didn't really mean 30 FPS. What they meant is it doesn't consistently average 60 FPS. And in system requirements lists, they generally state 30 or 60. They don't state an actual number, like the actual result. 30 just means it's around 30 and it's definitely not at 60. 60 means it's usually averaging around 60, but the GPUs they list for 30 are often sometimes, you know, actually well above 30, and that seems to be what we're seeing here. So we're kind of actually averaging more like in the mid 50s or so. Also, I want to go ahead and I think there was a frame rate cap somewhere in here that I want to make sure I go ahead and turn off. Because it looked like there was a FPS limit, which is set to smooth frame rate. Now, it's interesting to me. I almost want to investigate what that actually means. Is it just meaning it's trying not to let your GPU go too high opposed to the lows? And I'm curious how they're setting that. But I'm just going to go for performance reasons to unlimited. There's also options of 60 and 30. So interesting, and I think you go higher if your monitor did. I'm on a capture card right now. Anyway, so there's that. Now I've played through a bit of the intro. Not super far into this, but this seems fairly representative of overall performance. And again, you could argue whether or not these visuals justify an RTX 4090 running at less than 60 FPS. But I will say, as somebody who has used the 4090 a lot, this is not at all unheard of. It's often at maximum settings below 60 FPS at a native, or in this case, very close to native 4K resolution. So the next thing I'm going to do is say, what if we actually just use DLSS quality? So DLSS quality generally looks very close to native 4K, sometimes even better because it's sometimes less blurry than a TAA implementation, depends on the game. And now you can see that we are well into the well above 60 FPS territory. If I go ahead and hit the, let's see, if we're looking at the performance numbers here, we're kind of in the mid 70s. Depending on which direction I look, it can even go up into the 80s. So yeah, an RTX 4090, kick on DLSS quality, and you can play this game completely maxed out. And like I said, as far as I've been able to make it into the game, there doesn't really seem to be a lot of stuff way more demanding than this initial intro area. Although, again, this is just a short demo, and I didn't even complete the short demo for the purposes of this video. I just did want to counter the, oh no, the 4090, even with DLSS, can't hit 60 FPS stuff, because yeah, it appears to not be true. It's just that the ultra settings in the system requirements chart were confusing things. So I have some advice for game developers regarding system requirements charts, which is to avoid this type of confusion. I'm not necessarily opposed to upscaling being included in a system requirements chart. I know some of my viewers, I see comments where people are opposed to that happening at all. But realistically, I do think a lot of people use upscaling when they play a game, so it's not necessarily unreasonable to include that in your system requirements. But if you do, here's the key. If you choose to include upscaling in your system requirements chart, make it clear in the chart what that level of upscaling is. Because when you just say that this is ultra settings and that some amount of upscaling is being used, you're now leaving the user to guess. And honestly, like a lot of people would use performance mode upscaling at 4K and might use balance mode at 1440p, might use quality mode at 1080p. But that seems to be very different than what's happening in this system requirements chart. Now, when you're actually playing the game, it's clear what this means because you can see it in the game menu. But when you release a system requirements chart like this, the problem with just saying it's using upscaling without specifying any further is that we're all left in the dark and often are going to assume the worst case scenario until proven otherwise. So I think that is the issue that happened with this launch. Now, maybe you could also argue that and all press is good press if it gets your game's name out there. And I will actually say it got me to try this demo. This game was not otherwise on my radar. And speaking of radar, I like that this game, for example, doesn't have a mini-map or radar system. And so you're actually given environmental clues to find where you're going. Now, I haven't played far enough into the game to be sure if that's great or anything. But like, I generally like that more old school approach, making you pay attention to your environment. Now, I will say I wonder if in the full release, like maybe you don't just walk straight through cows and things like that. But let's go ahead and try this out on more modest hardware to get an idea of how it performs for people who don't have a 4090. Because quite frankly, these system requirements actually at the lower settings didn't look too crazy or anything, although the CPUs are pretty high. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this in a bit of a lower end system and we're gonna see how that goes. I'd say more typical system is really what I mean. All right, I'm now on an RTX 3060 with a Ryzen 5 5600X. This is typical kind of mid-range build from about 4 or 5 years ago. So I was curious how we'd be running on this. Let's go ahead and kick on the averages and all of that. And let me restart that real quick. Okay, yeah, looking like we're in kind of the mid-80s, but at what settings and performance and all of that? Well, what I'm looking at here is what the game defaulted to. So I'm starting out at 1080p, but we'll look at 1440p, whether that's doable as well. At the medium quality preset, unfortunately, that does include we're only at 60% of native rendering resolution using TSR upscaling. I've got two issues with this. Number one, on an RTX graphics card, I would prefer to be using DLSS. It'll probably look better at the same rendering resolution, which we can test. But also 60% on a 1080p output is pretty aggressive. Like, you'll notice that, as I spin around the character objects as they're disoccluded, there's definitely some shimmer in motion. And generally things do look a bit soft here. Although performance numbers are looking pretty solid on the RTX 3060. But like I said, that's one of my biggest issues. So one thing we could do is, slide this up to 100% and see what that looks like. So if we're trying to actually play at medium settings, but 100% of 1080p resolution, looks like now we're kind of down in the mid 50s or so. So definitely a bit less performance. If I start sprinting through things, we did see a little bit of a dip into the 40s. Okay, so there is that. This kind of watery area does seem to be one of the more demanding bits in this little intro area. So maybe we'll stay there. Now, the thing is, if I'm going to lower the internal rendering resolution, I'd rather use DLSS if I'm on this kind of a card. So let's go ahead and kick on DLSS quality. And so that would be 67% per axis rendering resolution, so a little higher internally than what it defaulted to with TSR on the medium preset. And again, I think things are a little more put together, as I pan around and in motion than what we saw with the TSR options, but for performance numbers are still pretty good here, up into the low 80s, maybe mid 80s if we're going by the averages. It definitely dips into the 70s though. Also there, we just saw a little bit of stutter on the frame time graph. I'm curious whether that was shader compilation or traversal. So if I go back there, will we get the same little stutter or not? Let's find out. A little bit, maybe less than what we had before. So unclear whether it's shader compilation stutter, which would not show up again on a repeat. Anyway, it could always be a little bit of both. But let's go ahead and play around with settings a little bit. So actually, it's looking like medium settings run pretty well at 1080p if you're willing to use quality level DLSS. A little under 60 FPS if you're trying to play it native. I'm actually curious how we do at 1440p. So if I move up to 1440p resolution, but we leave DLSS quality enabled, I'm curious if we'll be near 60 FPS. So, I kind of think we will be, but let's find out. So we're now at 1440p output, medium settings other than I have customized to DLSS quality rather than using the TSR 60%. And yeah, it looks like, okay, some dips into the mid 50s, but we are at least averaging around 60 FPS. So if you're at medium settings and willing to use some DLSS, even a card like a 3060 here does seem to be very, very usable. And I'm also not seeing any issues, at least in this scene, on my CPU. Perhaps actually we should go ahead and run a little bit further through here. One thing I'd want to keep my eye out for is, do we get any obvious stutters? This is Unreal Engine, which can all be traversal stutters as it loads in new areas. They can also be shader compilation stutters. Okay, we just went into this area with this house and things like that. Didn't see any obvious major frame time blips or anything like that. Yeah, averaging around 63 FPS, definitely with the 1% lows dropping into the 50s. But yeah, certainly looks completely playable at these settings and all that. So what do I think overall? I think that the system requirements chart, like I said, the lesser settings, like, their minimum specs and recommended specs and all that, never looked all that crazy anyway. And I think that this bears that out. You can definitely play the game on more modest hardware at more modest settings. The 4090 itself did not run at 60 FPS native maxed out 4K, but using DLSS quality, it was well over 60 FPS. So that's one of those things where I think part of this has to do with how do you want to communicate your system requirements. If it is upscaling as part of your presets, and you're talking about your presets, your system requirements chart should have made it more clear what level of upscaling is involved. All right, like I said, overall, I'm actually pretty intrigued by the demo. Curious what you guys think. It is a free demo. Check it out. The game doesn't come out for a few more months, so obviously there's time for things to change, performance, gameplay, all of that. I hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting, but thought it was worth a follow-up after that system requirement chart video. Hope all of you have an excellent day.